Thank you very much for that nice introduction for indeed what is my first visit to ESMT. And I must say, and I said this to my neighbor, Mr. Setcher, this is quite a different Audimax than the one I'm used to at the University of Karlsruhe. But I just realized if you hadn't joined ESMT, University of Karlsruhe must be the second best place in Germany. Because if you graduate in electrical engineering, you can become the CEO of Daimler-Benz. And if you only graduate in industrial engineering, you can still become the CEO of Lufthansa. So, or the other way around, if you do electronical engineering, you can do two-dimensional jobs, industrial engineering, three-dimensional. But we hopefully talk a little bit about the real dimension of technology later on today. It's about technology, it's about management. I understand that's what we want to discuss today. And it's maybe not by surprise that all three of us who are allowed to address you today indeed are from the world of mobility. And that, in my view, says two things. First of all, mobility is a cutting-edge industry, and technology is changing our industry. And also, in all modesty, it's a very interesting and fascinating industry where many other industries can be quite boring. Imagine having three speakers from the financial industry, for example. So, is there? Sorry. Not a good introduction for a first-time visit. So I might be here the last time as well, so you better listen carefully what I have to say. Yeah, of course, a few words about our industry and a few words about aviation in general, and of course a few words about Lufthansa as well. There must be a few customer here in the room, but that's of course why I'm particularly here. Mr. Zetsche mentioned the past and the future, and without coordinating, that's part of my little remarks as well. Because I think one thing is important, especially since we are in Germany, of course, trying to be international in the past. Legacy, history, and future, modernization, in no way are conflicting each other. I actually would go as far, if you look at many German companies, maybe some of them represented here, including banks, are showing that the perfect combination of legacy and thinking into the future can be a USP of our economy in Germany and of some of the landmark companies in Germany. And I think as education is, of course, about learning from the past and moving the next generation into shaping the future, I think that's important to have in mind, that it's not all about forgetting about the past, which sometimes, when you look at some of the American trends to some industries, I always find a little bit disturbing that there's not necessarily always the rooting in the past, which I think makes, again, some of us quite successful. In our case, it was in 1926 when we were founded that some of our pilots set out to fly to Asia. At that time, unheard of, and it actually took them 30 days to get to Beijing. Nowadays, to get to Beijing takes about 9 hours, and you can do it 4 times a day with my company alone. So I think that shows a little bit how the world has changed. Or it was just a couple of years later, in 28, our pilots set out to be the first ones to cross the North Atlantic from Europe towards the West, which is against the wind, so it's a more difficult way to do it. It took them 36 hours to get there, which was obviously an amazing time in 28. Nowadays, in 36 hours, basically you can cross the Atlantic back and forth twice, and probably still feel better when you arrive than how they must have felt after 36 hours. So I think it's obvious from all of our experience that things have changed enormously in our industry, fundamentally. Actually, our industry has not been an industry basically until the days of the 60s, when mass transport was really made possible with the more or less civil use of the jet aircraft. And our company, in all modesty, in those years has developed into one of the world leaders. And that was not easy. As of 45, aviation was banned in Germany. In Germany, we were not allowed to fly for 10 years until 1955. And you had all these engineers who, of course, in the war were on the cutting edge of technology as well. And one of the reasons, by the way, Germany still builds the best glider planes in the world, not at Airbus, the next speaker, but some other companies, is because all these engineers who didn't want to give up combining their drive for technology with their work, went to these only allowed at that time aviation in Germany, glider airplanes. And they were somehow able to stay there long enough to, when in 55, when aviation was opened up, make 2 success stories in Germany possible again. And that, of course, one is Airbus, Tom will talk about, and the other one, I think, is us, where we have developed from nothing in 1955 to the largest aviation group in the world in the last years. So I think technology has been driving that process. But, and I think Mr. Setcher made a nice introduction in that regard, technology nowadays is not the same as digitalization. And sometimes when people invite to talk about the future and talk about technology, it always drills down to digitalization. And I just don't believe that's true. Like mobility probably is the one industry where, of course, there is huge disruptive elements, definitely in the car industry. Mr. Setcher explained some, in our industry as well. But one thing is for sure, it's not to be foreseen that the core element of mobility, moving people or goods from A to B, be it by car, be it by train, be it by airplanes, can anyway be disrupted to be replaced by something else. And I think that is the difference to the financial industry, for example, to the entertainment industry, to many industries. That basically moving something physically is something which is disturbed, disrupted around it, the interface is to it, but the physical element itself is not. Which is, by the way, if you believe that your cars until recently have been behind the iPhones, you should visit our airplanes. And that's not criticizing Tom Enders. It's the same with the other company in Seattle, which tries to build airplanes. My iPhone breaks down once a week. Imagine our airplanes had that reliability of an iPhone. And my car hasn't broken down in years, but if it does break down, I just stop. In an airplane, you can't do that. So I think technology and digitalization are overlapping in an enormous way. Technology is more than digitalization. And secondly, I think moving the world forward in terms of technology cannot only be done by the pace of digitalization, because it's just too dangerous. The failure rates are too high. In many ways, by the way, the technical failure rates of our iPhones breaking down, also the entrepreneurial failure rates. To start a startup and to close it after a few months is one thing. It happens all the time. It's part of the innovation culture that industry has. And like Daimler-Benz, of course, we also have a connection to that kind of culture, entrepreneurial culture. Developing a new aircraft or even developing a new route, which really is what I'm responsible for, and failing shouldn't happen to you too often because it can basically endanger your company. So I think, especially to the students in the room, I think it's important that looking at the past and our legacy, looking into the future, there is, of course, no way to ignore digitalization. It's in the core of what we do, but there's more around it, and I think that's key. Our company moves about 400,000 people a day safely. That is at a failure rate which, fortunately, is down at 0.0000, and is not in any way boring because of that. We transport 6,000 tons of cargo every day, which really makes globalization feasible. In my view, globalization is not just the global data transport or transport of financial means. Basically, globalization is people moving across the world, goods moving across the world. But in our case, as we don't just operate airlines, we operate service companies around airlines like catering, or MRO, maintenance, repair, and overhaul. Every 5th aircraft in the world is actually maintained by Lufthansa Technik, and every 3rd meal you anywhere in the world enjoy or don't enjoy on an airplane comes from our kitchens as well. And those 140 million people we are flying around the world only represent 4% of the global passenger volume, which is some special situation in our industry that even being the largest aviation group in the world, you only have 4% market share. So consolidation is about to happen. In other industries, the strong ones buy the weak ones. Consolidation takes place in a much higher speed than our industry. But since our industry is regulated in many, many ways, is global as anything could be global, flying from Sydney to Frankfurt or from New York to Tokyo, at the same time, It's highly regulated because infrastructure still is seen as part of what governments are very interested in. And that is also, I think, one of my advices to those people who go as students, as young executives into the future. It's not only about technical feasibility. I think we all, especially those of us who have executive responsibility, also need to keep in balance what this means to other stakeholders. And stakeholders, not obviously stakeholders like customers who you need to develop your business, or the obvious important stakeholder of your staff. I think it's also the next stakeholder, putting the shareholders aside, of course, who also are part of that core triangle, is the stakeholder of society. So what are we really providing towards society? Or in a more defensive way, where are changes in society limiting what we can do in technology? And that's probably more true, for example, biotech industry than it is true for our transportation industry. But there are limits of what you can do due to limits which are outside of the technological feasibility of what you do. And I think sometimes talking to young people who, of course, are eager to change the world, I think it's important to remind them that there are limits beyond that, what the pure technology we are also fascinated by is allowing us to do. And one of those limits in our industry, which we are currently basically seeing, is not technological limits, where engineers don't have new ideas or digitalization wouldn't provide new thoughts. We have very physical limitations, as physical as not finding enough pilots around the world to fly all these aircraft. That's something 10 years ago we wouldn't have thought it could ever limit our growth. We don't find enough engineers and mechanics to maintain some of these aircraft around the world. We don't have enough airports to land all these aircraft, or the ones we have are not used efficiently enough. And sometimes airports are only used 60% of their capability, again, not because of technological limits, but just because the people around the airport want to have their peace for a few hours at night at least. So I think it's another example of technological feasibilities not purely just being used to their level of exploitation just because of the fact there's limiting factors. Nevertheless, the industry has grown tremendously. Our company, has grown at least by 20% over the last 3 years. We now have grown up to 800 aircraft, most of them actually built by Airbus, as hopefully Tom always remembers. Yeah, thank you. And that has brought us to a leading position, but I would not describe leading nowadays just by pure numbers, be it turnover or in our case number of aircraft or number of cars. I think when I talk about lead, I talk a lot about that we are the leading employer in our industry. I think the human resource element of what a company does in the end probably is a bigger differentiator to our competitors than many other things we do. That's why I'm actually happy to be here at ESMT, because I think it is important that those of us who bear responsibility are looking into probably ultimately the most limiting resource, which is HR, human resource, and we spend more time and sometimes even spend more money on developing that resource just as we spend on R&D, or in our case on, of course, the most expensive resource we spend money on, which is fuel. So we train people around the world, not only at ESMT, but also here. We try to be more international in our training, which sounds always easier than it is, to be honest, starting with the language issue. Who works for our company, which is a very German company from its origin, who really works in our company and has not just lived abroad. I think nowadays every graduate has lived abroad somewhere, but who really moves around in English as he moves around in his mother tongue, German. That is still something which is unsexy to talk about, but I find something which I experience every day. And especially, I just came back from our global association meeting in Sydney. When you meet these Anglo-Saxon players in the industry, their pure advantage in language is still something which I think cannot just be ignored. So trying to become more international, I think, both in the student body, but also in the way we teach the next generation, is not something people find boring because it has been talked about for 30 years. I think it's just as up to date as it always has been. Or another issue, if you look at historically in Germany, the DIN, the standards of industrial engineering being set by initially a German institute of norming and providing regulations. If you now look at other parts of the industry, of the global economy, including aviation, the Anglo-Saxons have purely taken over that element of the industry, setting standards, setting rules, setting laws, and that, of course, usually not to the disadvantage of those countries where these people come from. So I think with all the legacy of high-tech in Germany, of high-tech in Europe, I think it's important that that global element we all are so aware of, and surely in all modesty, somebody who runs an airline is well aware of, because we live off globalization, is something we need, in my view, put into more importance when it comes to educating the next generation. Talk about the next generation. In our case, we are hiring 8,000 people alone this year. And the question of choosing the right ones, those who only want to stay a year, those who look for lifetime employment, and sometimes those who you would like to have for lifetime employment are those who leave after a year, and sometimes those who you would like to leave after a year are the ones who decide for lifetime employment. That is also a challenge, of course, combined with German labor laws, which makes it even more important that we have a focus on finding the right, again, resource in terms of human resource, and that's why we in Lufthansa at least are so proud to at least dedicate a lot of our time to it, and I think it should be even more. In the end, just being a commodity doesn't work, and differentiating each other in our industry has at a certain degree to do with technology. I will come to that in the final minutes of my little presentation, but the differentiating factor indeed are the people you hire, the people you train, the people you lead, the way people lead. So I think with all love for technology, being an engineer, with all love for the technology advancements of our industry in the last years, it is in the end the individuals. And there I think the things come together. As I said before, aviation is a fascinating industry. We find it fairly easy to attract people to our industry, but to keep them in the system, to make sure, also Mr. Setcher explained that, to have enough legacy in the company, stability, that all of you can enter an airplane safely, and at the same time enough challenge by young people, new people who want to do things differently. I think that's a nice balance which makes our job also so exciting. I don't really want my people to reinvent the way we land an Airbus 380 every day. I'm quite happy that there's years of training and practice behind that. When it comes to the digital way of selling our tickets, I'm very happy that there is almost weekly ideas how we can do that better. And when I just came back from China a couple of weeks ago, 70% of our tickets in China we sell via the mobile phone. A long way to go for that in Germany, where people still call their travel agencies. So that is, I think it's quite obvious in this room what the future will be. And to adapt to that at least as fast as your customers want you to adapt, or being a leading player in any industry, even being faster than your customers and try to shape the industry and the way people try to behave, of course, is a core challenge, again, in a company which is not a startup and only thinking about innovation every day, but it has to create some liability, some reliability, some standards of production at the same time. So what is the future in terms of technology? Why is it such an exciting time? I think we all live in, because innovation has happened in this industry sometimes faster than others. It was only 50 years ago that we introduced electronic booking systems. Until 50 years ago, people in Frankfurt had paper files. People from around the world would call, is there a seat available on Lufthansa 401 from New York to Frankfurt on the 10th of November? People would look through the file, would check the number of people on the list, and would say, yeah, we have 5 more seats available. That's only 50 years ago. And the aviation industry was the first industry to introduce electronic booking. So I think that shows you how things have come. It's only 20 years ago that electronic tickets were introduced in our industry. Moving away from paper tickets has taken another 10 years. And of course, nowadays, we have gone to paperless basically wherever we can. We have paperless cockpits where people in our pilots don't have charts anymore physically, but just bring them up on their iPads. We have, of course, nowadays paperless entertainment on board where people don't bring their magazines anymore but load them on their files. So I think it's obvious that the digitalization has taken place there. But I think the most exciting thing indeed is taking place on the customer end, because there also failure rates can be higher than on the operational side of the business. I think that's, once again, I repeat that without trying to be boring here. There is, of course, a difference in how advanced you can be trying things when it comes to about just trying new business model, when lives eventually could be endangered. And for that kind of technology, being as fast as anybody, we have here in Berlin introduced an innovation hub, as we call it, because indeed working at the headquarters in Frankfurt and combining those two cultures with each other is a difficult thing. So we thought already going to Berlin is something which allows more freedom of thinking, trial and error, different cultural attitude. And again, I'm talking not about the operational things of the company, but of the more or less commercial adventures, products and services. We now decided to go to Asia, to China with our innovation hub to bring more of that dynamic in. In our particular industry, the US is not necessarily the place where standards are set. If you ever have flown on a US airline, you know what I'm talking about. So it is more towards the East, China and Singapore, where we are believing that there could be also a cultural addition to what we do in Lufthansa and where we try to bring people in. We are spending more or less 500 million in the next 3 years on digitalization alone. Compare that with about 10 billion we spend for new aircraft in the next 3 years. That might be fairly limited, but it goes back to what I said before. The core, of course, has to be right. But also, and this will allow me to hand over to Tom eventually, the advancements in operating new aircraft, of course, are huge. If we introduce a new aircraft nowadays, it basically reduces fuel consumption by 25%. And of course, emissions as well. And of course, lowers other fuel bill at the same time at 25%. Unfortunately, his aircraft are so expensive, it almost compensates that, but that's not for public discussion. But let's come to something where we both have an advantage. Those modern aircraft take 50% less fuel. And those, noise, 25% less fuel, 50% less noise. And this comes back to what I said before. Who else, as in our management job, has a say beyond the triangle of stakeholder, customer, staff, and shareholder? Society. Basically, with 50% less noise, it doesn't show up on your balance sheet. It doesn't show up on your profit and loss statement because nobody is charging you for noise, at least to a serious degree. But still, there is a responsibility out there. And if you talk about people outside of our industry, about the aviation industry, they speak a lot more about noise than they speak about other things we like them to talk about. So responsibilities for stakeholders outside of your classical stakeholder environment, I think, is key. And that's why, in our particular case, innovation, which, and I'm sure Tom will talk about that, highly depends on new aircraft designs, on new engine designs, on new technology being used in the engines, even more sometimes than in the aircraft itself, is of course driving this industry and making it able to show the growth we believe this industry will have. We as an industry think that we will grow by 100% in the next 20 years. So that's a very nice problem to have because many of you, I'm sure, working in industries where you don't know if there will be growth in the future, where there might not be enough growth in the future compared to the past, or again, there might be a disruptive element which will not bring growth but even shrinkage to your core business models in the future. That is not our problem, but again, it's only able with modern technology to actually cope with that growth, to make that growth feasible, make that growth being transbendable to other parts of the world in a safe way where we are going beyond the mature markets of North America and Asia to a high degree, and surely Europe, and also to making that growth acceptable for those stakeholders I was trying to refer a little bit to, because it is not a growth which is getting to 100% on the same in terms of noise, pollution, and so on. So that, I think, is where technology makes our industry not only feasible, going back to what I explained, how it all started in 26 and 28 and where it has come to today. I think it's only with technology used in a responsible way, beyond, again, focus on digitalization alone, and beyond the focus on just trying to make feasible whatever is feasible, but keeping in mind there's other responsibilities, is what really makes technology and management, and this, I guess, is what we're here to talk about today, exciting because it has to fit into each other. One of the two things can be easy, not easy in an intellectual way, but easy in a moral way, easy in a stakeholder way of thinking, combining the two in a responsible way, and also, of course, in a way that will help your company to thrive, because that's in the end what we are all there for, safeguarding jobs, safeguarding customer interest, safeguarding shareholder value, creating value to those who own companies. I think that's the real world challenge. Also, ESMT hopefully is preparing the next generation for, and we very much look forward indeed to work with you more on that. And I think, again, in our industry, you need partners to really move the technology forward. One of our closest partners will be speaking in a few minutes. So I hope I was giving you some insight in an industry and a company you all hopefully have heard about and used. Of course, I have business card for complaints about the current delays when we have a coffee break after this. But we are proud in this industry not just to create shareholder value, not just to satisfy customer need, not just to safeguard jobs, the famous stakeholder triangle, but we are proud to making this world a smaller place and to add to globalization in a positive way, to have a positively acceptable contribution to globalization, which we all need is the mega trend of our times. And different than probably most of us in this room, it's not shared by everybody in this world. The globalization is something positive. We believe exchanging people around the world is what we as the good guys in globalization can provide. So thanks for listening. Thanks for being a stakeholder one way or another, be it a customer, be it a shareholder, be it a future staff member. And we just designed a new slogan for our advertisement campaign, which reads, "We say yes to the world," and we're proud of that, to make this world an even better place. Thanks for listening. It will be your job in the next generation to continue that. Thanks.
Thank you very much for such a multifaceted way of looking into technology. When you just said, "We say yes to the world," it could be in a certain way also the mission statement of ESMT. So we have students here from 50, 60, maybe even more countries from all over the world. And you also specifically talked about the HR dimension of technology and to make it such an important part. Now, we obviously try a lot also to make our students prepare them for entering, for example, a German company. We work with the Goethe Institute and other things. What else do you think companies, business schools can do to enable this globalization also on this side?
Well, when I think about business schools, international business schools, I have two dimensions inside where they can help to close the gap. One, obviously, is, let's call it the horizontal dimension of bridging the global international gap. Make people move from one place to the other, learn the language, exchange with students from other parts of the world. But the other one is this vertical, I would like to call it, dimension. Being just a tech geek is not what we need. Being just somebody who wants to make the work a better place, so there's places for those people, but not necessarily in our company. So to combine that both in management and technology, I think that's what really is what we are looking for. And in all modesty, not only us, but those people who want to make this world progress, our economy progress, our globalization progress. And I think it's there where schools like yours can play a role. When it comes to unilateral, one-dimensional education, I would even go as far as saying there is probably always somebody better. It'd be better than MIT in technology. Research will be difficult for you, and there probably have been schools teaching philosophy for 400, 500 years where it's also difficult for you to catch the race. But to combine those two things, again, about international education and thinking from what technology is possible to what the world needs, and how do you make large organizations accept it, how do you lead people to support your ideas, that's, I think, where your USP shall be and should be.
Well, thank you. And one more question regarding, we now hear a lot about, not probably in the aviation industry, about the cultural acceptance for failure. And that obviously has completely different dimensions for you than as it has for other companies. At the same time, you say you also have an innovation hub here that goes in this way. How is it for you to integrate those views? On the one hand, to be absolutely without any failure is a crucial ingredient for your future success, and at the same time for enabling this type of failure culture.
Well, looking at the time, but this is something I could talk about for a long time because it's a key challenge for us. First of all, it has a lot to do with honesty. There is room for failure also on the very top. And when we had our staff judging the board a few months ago, their biggest criticism about us is that we don't have a failure policy and culture. So we did a lot on that one. We have so-called fuck-up nights where we invite people to talk about their biggest failure. I haven't been there personally, but I would have a few stories to tell, like any executive probably has. So we're trying to make people aware that also on the very top there's room for failure and want to hear about it. The more we close to operations, the more I think we have developed a failure culture, which is key for our safety. So there is basically a non-putative system that you can report any error you made in the cockpit or in maintaining an aircraft, and we try to learn from it without the people reporting it being punished. I've just been to our flight school in Arizona because we are looking for 500 new pilots every year. And those of you who are not happy at ESMT and look for a second career, I can I also have business cards for that. So we tell young pilots from the very first day, if they make something wrong, the other person reminds him, it's always two people in the cockpit obviously, say thanks to those who make notice of your failure. That is not a natural behavior for super egos like us, okay? So when you make a failure and somebody makes you aware of it, usually if people like us, we have a quick answer why that failure was not a failure. But that is not what we want in the cockpit. So I think it's part of our culture to make sure that that failure culture we developed in our cockpits for many years is brought into the top management, where again, if somebody tries to point out that something could have done better, maybe even the CEO says thanks for that advice, and doesn't find a quick story why, of course, the way things were done were exactly the way things had to be done. So I think that's a long process. And by us, indeed, coming back to your question, being required to have both, we try to combine them to create that transparency and honesty, which I think eventually supports both cultures in one company. And we need both. Again, when it comes to our innovation hub, we fail every day. When it comes to our operation with 4,000 flights a day, knock on wood, we work hard, very hard, not to fail at all.
Thank you. Thank you very much.